Today, Augustine is known for being a prime source for understanding the tradition of just war theory, and any undertaking of its consideration probably should include a familiarity with the African father. By now, you have probably realized that the principles of the just war doctrine are valuable. Now it's time to move from the scriptures to one of Christianity's most brilliant, influential, and prolific authors to see what Augustine has given us for our use in applying the law of God to the engagement of war. Your present familiarity with just war thinking will come in handy as we review Augustine's insights. Use what you know to ask some of these questions as we go through. What authority does Augustine actually have in the tradition of just war thinking? Is it that his insights resonate with Scripture? Or is it that they resonate more with good reasoning? Or are those the same thing? Is it that Augustine was a bright light of Christian theology in general, his name bestowing, as it were, an authority to his arguments beyond the arguments in isolation? Or is it that his comments are, in fact, more illuminating and more faithful to Scripture than any who had disagreed with him? Finally, the question I wish I didn't have to ask, but is being opened in this decade among Augustine scholars: did Augustine hold the just war doctrine? But a generally prevailing take on Augustine's his war thinking is given here from Albert Marin back in 1971. Not the least of his accomplishments, that is, Augustine's accomplishments, was the synthesizing of Ciceronian and Christian ideas about war. To this day, his synthesis is at the base of both Roman Catholic teaching and the teaching of the leading Protestant denominations. Unfortunately, prolific writer that he was, he left no treatise specifically on the subject, scattering his conclusions throughout his writings. Moreover, certain ambiguities are introduced as a result of his juxtaposing considerations of private morality with that of society, and then shifting the terms of discussion from one to the other without warning. But these difficulties are resolvable in accordance with a few basic concepts. A quick word on what Augustine means when he talks about war. It's not limited to battles, but can include any time there is some kind of armed conflict. Maybe even the Cold War would be considered that. Quote from Augustine: "Keep in mind that war is not an uninterrupted succession of battles, but instead that they are sometimes frequent, sometimes rare, and sometimes there are none at all." Now some details. First of all, Augustine was not one of the rigorists, as Pastor Berg called Tertullian. He was not a pacifist. Other church fathers previously were pacifistic, including even some fellow Africans, like Tertullian and Lactantius. But if we were to divide Christian thought on this topic into two camps, pacifism on one side and just war doctrine on the other, most of the earliest Christian writers did not obviously fall into either category because they did not explicitly address the questions. Since the formulas of the just war doctrine are not systematically outlined in Scripture or in the church fathers, let's briefly note some of the notches along the way towards Augustine, where he was, in comparison, quite clear and precise. Clement of Alexandria, for example, remarked that soldiers can remain soldiers and obey God. Origen is claimed by the pacifists because he opposed Christians entering into military service, but he did not reject all warfare as immoral, and he said that Christians should be praying for their emperor's victory. Eusebius of Caesarea, as one of the first who wrote in a Constantinian context, said that a secondary kind of perfection could be achieved by those who fight just wars for the emperor. And Basil affirmed that killing in war was not murder, but suggested that those whose, quote, hands were unclean were to abstain from the sacrament for 3 years. That'd be an interesting thing to look into at some point. Then we come to Ambrose, who was Augustine's mentor. If imperial and Christian influences had begun to flirt with each other, then Ambrose helped break the ice, and he attended their marriage. That's what I wrote. He had held a high governmental office before being bishop, and he envisioned the name of Jesus Christ now being the banner in front of the armies in place of the Roman eagle, and expected God's majesty to grant protection and victory to the emperor. Now that'd be fascinating to look more into, but we're going to have to move in with Augustine right now, and leave Ambrose for another time. So pacifism, of course, is the idea that any violence, including war, is unjustifiable under any circumstances, and that all disputes should be settled by peaceful means. When Augustine attacked pacifism most directly, he did so in the context of Manichaeism. The Manichaeans accused that Yahweh of the Old Testament was a different God from Christ in the New, with that contradiction easily proven, given that Yahweh directed wars for Israel, Christ commanded, "Do not resist the evildoer." Augustine had to show that Christ's teachings of meekness and non-retaliation did not mean God condemned war. And we'll say more about that later. But at this point, we know that the pacifism Augustine reacted to was a Manichaean pacifism. Another piece of Augustine's historical context was the fall of the empire. You remember this was partly the occasion for the writing of the City of God, as the heathen were blaming the empire's fall on its having abandoned the old gods and become Christian. Thus, Christ's teachings of meekness and non-retaliation, it was thought, had weakened the defense of the state. But Augustine had to beat back that accusation as well. So on the one hand, he beat down the pacifists. On the other hand, he beat down the anti-pacifists, clarifying his understanding of the right use of force, even in armed conflict, which could never be called pacifism. Augustine has a long chain, which Pastor Berg already basically gave us in its entirety. The gospel verses that support the idea that God is not altogether against soldiers and fighting. You've got a quote here from Augustine regarding David, regarding the soldiers talking to John the Baptist, Cornelius, the one who asked the Lord to help his servant and said, "I have soldiers under me," etc. Augustine concludes, certainly he did not prohibit them to serve as soldiers when he commanded them to be content with their pay for the service, with John the Baptist soldiers. And Jesus says to pay those taxes, pay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and that includes military finance. There were then Roman and imperial influences in Augustine's thought. Sometimes he reflected traditional Roman themes. Now, Philip Wynne, one of my prime sources for research, believes that Augustine's conditioning by, quote, larger historical and geopolitical factors could act to override the scruples arising from the rigorous tradition, like in Tertullian. But I think that's maybe conjecture, as it would seem to suggest Philip Wynne's assumption that Augustine, he would have been more pacifistic had he not been so near to the military culture in his contemporary Africa. But there are, however, several places where Augustine obviously cites Roman precedent for illustrating his points. The whole world remembers Rome for its great extension over many peoples, its imperialism. So what did Augustine think of that? He has some nuanced layers of judgment for this question. Augustine did value Rome's imperial expansion, but not for the same reason that Rome itself valued it. While Rome was motivated by the attainment of glory, and in that pursuit managed to secure peace along with it, Augustine would have rather seen everybody's motive been peace all along. Thus, insofar as Rome's domination resulted in a greater degree of peace, Augustine was thankful. On the other hand, insofar as Roman assimilation spawned horrendous civil wars, this was evidence of the fragility of that peace. It would have been better if the expansion had not been necessary, but it was, according to Augustine. In his heart, I would say, Augustine reveals both a hatred for the conditions which generated Roman imperialism, but also a love for the peace and the justice status which it was able to attain through that domination. Roman imperialism was God's imperfect tool. Though it could not have come about without this one nation's lust for domination, yet it was intended by God to be a punishment and curb for the worst vices of other nations. A quote from Augustine: "Let them ask then whether it is quite fitting for good men to rejoice in extended empire. For the iniquity of those with whom just wars are carried on favors the growth of a kingdom, and would certainly have been small if the peace and justice of neighbors had not by any wrong provoked the carrying on of war against them. And human affairs being thus more happy, all kingdoms would have been small, rejoicing in neighborly concord, and thus there would have been very many kingdoms in the world, as there are very many houses of citizens in a city. Therefore, to carry on war and extend a kingdom over wholly subdued nations seems to bad men to be felicity, but to good men necessity." And again he says, "Because it would be worse that the injurious should rule over those who are more righteous. Therefore, even to carry on war and extend a kingdom is not unsuitably called felicity. But beyond doubt, it is greater felicity to have a good neighbor at peace than to conquer a bad one by making war. Your desires are bad when you desire that one whom you hate or fear should be in such a condition that you can conquer him." You can see it's pretty nuanced, Augustine's mixed feelings on the overlord emperor of Rome. There were also Neoplatonic influences that bring Augustine's thought into what it was. Even his definition of justice bears the mark of Neoplatonism. Accordingly, justice is that which orders the universe. A just war is one which restores order and renders to each party what it deserves. If the universe is a hierarchy of being with God at the top, of perfect being and perfect goodness, all other things are ordered under him, sharing a degree of being and a degree of goodness. Injustice occurs when there is an unwarranted disordering of things. When something is loved which should not be loved, or loved unequally which should be loved equally, etc. Quote, "This injustice is seen in every case where a man loves for their own sake things which are desirable only as means to an end, and seeks for the sake of something else things which ought to be loved for themselves. For thus, as far as he can, he disturbs in himself the natural order, which the eternal law requires us to observe. Again, a man is just when he seeks to use things only for the end for which God appointed them, and to enjoy God as the end of all, while he enjoys himself and his friend in God and for God." Also with Neoplatonic thinking, everything that exists must have a degree of good. And a degree of being, that is to say. Because it has a degree of being, it must have a degree of good, or a good component. War exists. Therefore, war has a good component. And what that good component is what we call the just war. So John Mark Maddox writes that for Augustine, quote, "Particular wars may exist which are in some sense good, perhaps even on the balance good. We need to wax more theological, more scriptural now. This has been hinted at already, but it deserves its place, that since God is in control of world events, and all things work together for the good of those who love him, Augustine is certainly willing to grant that some wars are absolutely just. This is, some of those are the prescriptive wars of the Old Testament. Every war that God permits, and that includes every war in the world, benefits God's children toward their eternal salvation. Quote, "When war is undertaken in obedience to God, who would rebuke or humble or crush the pride of man, it must be allowed to be a righteous war. For even the wars which arise from human passion cannot harm the eternal well-being of God, nor even hurt his saints. For in the trial of their patience and the chastening of their spirit, and in bearing fatherly correction, they are rather benefited than injured. No one can have any power against them but what is given him from above, for there is no power but of God, who either orders or permits. As a side note, there is some ambiguity there. Is Augustine only talking about those wars which are prophetically authorized, or is he talking about sort of the general scheme of world history where God is always rebuking and humbling through wars? We'll talk about how that ambiguity stays in Augustine. We don't always get a clear answer. The acknowledgement of God's providence entails deference to his knowledge, which is inaccessible to us. Quote, "Who can tell whether it may be good or bad in any particular case, in time of peace to reign or to serve, or to be at ease or to die, or in time of war to command or to fight, or to conquer or to be killed? At the same time, it remains true that whatever is good is so by the divine blessing, and whatever is bad is so by the divine judgment." And there is, like Pastor Bird pointed out, a dividing line down the center of history. And this is true for Augustine as well. The dispensational shift from the old covenant to the new. The use of force in war was directed by God for Israel in the former days, while in the latter days, Christ enjoins us to submit to the force of our opponents. Augustine explains that this is not a contradiction in God, but reveals the fullness of God's doctrine. Quote, "Let no one be so daring as to make rash charges against, not to say against God. If the service of the ministers of the Old Testament, who were also heralds of the New, consisted in putting sinners to death, and that of the ministers of the New Testament, who are also interpreters of the Old, in being put to death by sinners, the service in both cases is rendered to one God, who, varying the lesson to suit the times, teaches both that temporal blessings are to be sought from him, and they are to be forsaken for him. Temporal distress is both sent by him and should be endured for him." It's remarkable, however, that on the question whether the temporal authority may coerce unbelievers into the visible Catholic communion, Augustine changed his mind from no to yes, because supposedly he had seen evidence with the Donatists that such force may serve in the cause toward genuine conversion. He said, "I have yielded to the facts suggested to me by my colleagues, although my first feeling about it was that no one was to be forced into the unity of Christ, but that we should act by speaking, fight by debating, and prevail by our reasoning, for fear of making pretended Catholics out of those whom we know as open heretics. But this opinion of mine was overcome, not by the words of those who controverted it, but by conclusive examples." A very interesting conclusion of Augustine. Now, this is one of the criteria of just war, and we're going to be going through a few of those and seeing how Augustine runs parallel with them. Just cause. What is this? Well, in explanation to this criterion, John Mark Maddox wrote, "The reason for resorting to war must itself be a just reason." Augustine said, "As a rule, just wars are defined as those which avenge injuries. If some nation or state against whom one is waging war has neglected to punish a wrong committed by its citizens, or to return something that was wrongfully taken." Vengeance. Let's look at Augustine's understanding of vengeance as a just cause. In avenging injuries, as Augustine puts it, it may not surprise us that he views material restitution, when possible, as a just component in the return to the status quo before the war. Moreover, Augustine at times also approves compensation paid by the offender, which goes above and beyond a return to the status quo. This would be a sort of what you call punitive damages as a moral deterrent. Restitution cannot, however, be made for all injuries, and when that is the case, the offended party should waive their rights to an exact revenge. Another noteworthy element in his thinking of just cause is his understanding of an injury which ought to be avenged. Now, Augustine has indicated that a nation's sins against God are a kind of injury that requires punishment through the undertaking of war. And he says this: the real evils of war are love of violence, revengeful cruelty, fierce and implacable enmity, wild resistance, the lust of power, and the like. And it is generally to punish these things, when force is required to inflict the punishment, that in obedience to God or some lawful authority, good men undertake wars, when they find themselves in such a position as regards the conduct of human affairs that right conduct requires them to act, or to make others act in this way. Now here, this has caused a little bit of controversy. John Mark Maddox believes that when Augustine says this, Augustine is approving the undertaking of war in response to these kind of sins, even when the side undertaking the war is not an aggrieved party. This kind of goes into our last question and answer session. What about, who has jurisdiction over a nation's sins if they're not being taken care of by the sovereign authority? Well, here's the thing. Maddox thinks Augustine is allowing for sins against God to be something requiring redress, which is a very significant conclusion. However, I don't believe that this passage successfully upholds that conclusion, because the immediate context on that page of Augustine's argument does not really go in that direction. And it leads me to think that if Maddox's assertion is propped up by only that quote, then perhaps there's no better place where Augustine actually teaches that more clearly. So no, I would disagree with John Mark Maddox in that regard. Augustine does not clearly discuss the distinction between an offensive and defensive war. Certainly, defense of the fatherland against invasion is permitted and even necessary. Defense against offense is normally how Augustine conceived of wars coming into being. He was kind of an idealist in that way. Moreover, the definition of victory for Augustine seems to include conquest, almost of necessity. That is, if the defending side is strong enough, it will purchase as much peace as it can by conquering the offender. That is the gift of God and the only peace available to the earthly city. Quote, when victory remains with the party which had the juster cause, who hesitates to congratulate the victor and style it a desirable peace? This was generally true in the case of Rome. Augustine had mixed feelings, like we said, regarding Rome's expansion, but they were defensive battles, as Augustine thought, with a just cause, and yet they were not free from lust for power and glory. And we'll come to that later. Criterion jus ad bellum, comparative justice, which is defined as this: there is always a strong moral presumption against going to war. The criterion of comparative justice has to do with comparing. The criterion is met when the claims of an aggrieved party are of such magnitude that the presumption against war is overridden. In war, here's a question I heard being talked about outside. Does Augustine view only one side of the war to be just, while the other must be unjust? Well, generally that is how he speaks. In the city of God, he says, it is the wrongdoing of the opposing party which compels the wise man to wage just wars. The majority of just war historians interpret Augustine as holding that there can be justice on only one side of a war. And yet there is a minority interpretation held by John Mark Maddox, for example, which sees Augustine allowing for a measure of rightness on both sides. For Maddox, Augustine basically grants this in his broader scope, since Augustine says there's no absolutely just state anywhere. And in the quote which we heard above, when victory remains with the party which had a, quote, juster cause, aren't we happy if they win? And so he introduces this. Augustine himself says that there may be one with a juster cause. It's provocative, but not quite definitive. Darrell Cole, on the other hand, man who wrote the book When God Says War is Right, Darrell Cole holds that the entire idea of comparative justice is bunk, an invention of modern man that assumes we can never truly know whose side is right and whose side is wrong. So he sees this criterion as epistemologically dangerous. Darrell Cole believes present generations have abandoned the classical virtues of justice, prudence, courage, and temperance. Now, in their place, there is nothing left to curb wrongdoing but relativism. And according to Cole, comparative justice, aka relativism, in his mind, is an attempt in modern just war theory to curb wrongdoing by blurring the distinction between who is right and who is wrong. That ambiguity can minimize violent impulses by making us humble, by saying we don't really know if we're right, so we won't hurt you as bad. And we don't know if you're really wrong, so we won't make you look like inhuman brutes in our propaganda. But I think that reaction misses the point of what comparative justice really is seeking to accomplish. It's not a postmodern device to blur the lines between who is right and wrong. It is simply, as Maddox defined it, the criterion that the claims of an aggrieved party must be of such magnitude that presumption against war is overridden. That's the comparison of justice that's being made. Next up, rightful intention. Now, for some reason, my pages have gone out of whack here. I need to get the right page. Right intention is different from just cause. You know, they sound similar, but they are different in that some war can have a just cause and yet be spoiled by a bad intention. So these are done. Here we go. It's possible for a war to have a just cause while the motives attending it being unjust. Hatred, love of violence, cruelty, desire for expansion, these are wrong intentions that would make an otherwise just war unjust. So evidence of keeping right intentions would be found in things such as efforts made to achieve peace without war, keeping demands within bounds of reason, etc. So Augustine's understanding of justice makes this theme very prominent in his writings. That is, the rightness of an external action depends on the rightness of the internal disposition. He recognizes that the lust for domination defiled the history of Rome, though its tradition was continuously to whitewash and mask the barbarism with adulations of glory and greatness and victory. Rome's disposition toward its defensive battles, Augustine condemns. Sure, its battles were defensive and perhaps they had a just cause, but there was a common harboring of gladness when it was time for Rome to fight. Because they knew that they were going to win and their territory would expand. Such a wrong intent, though the war may be just in its cause, can from within invalidate its just status. Well, I've repeated that twice now. In criticizing the Roman deities, Augustine uses an interesting turn of logic to ask, if victory was to be worshipped as a goddess in the Roman pantheon, why not also that which generates victory, namely foreign injustice? For foreign injustice is what so consistently provoked wars and led to Rome's conquest. So consistency would require that for a man of wrong intention, it is a good and lovely thing that Rome's neighbors be so wicked. And it's absurd. You know, this absurdity reveals the corrupting potential of intention. He says, therefore, to carry on a war and extend a kingdom over wholly subdued nations seems to bad men to be felicity, to good men necessity. Now, what should be the disposition of the general or the soldier who must fight a war. One is anguish, Augustine says, a grief at war's necessity. Quote, "They say the wise man will wage just wars, as if he would not all the rather lament the necessity of just wars, if he remembers that he is a man. For if they were not just, he would not wage them, and would therefore be delivered from all wars. For it is the wrongdoing of the opposing party which compels the wise man to wage just wars. And this wrongdoing, even though it give rise to no war, would still be a matter of grief to man, because it is man's wrongdoing. Let everyone then who thinks with pain on all these great evils, so horrible, so ruthless, acknowledge that this is misery. And if anyone either endures or thinks of them without mental pain, this is a more miserable plight still, for he thinks himself happy because he has lost human feeling." Again, in a significant passage, Augustine writes that sick intentions are often the very evils of war, while the righteousness of war is the punishment of those intentions. That's a quote that we've actually quoted a couple times already now. Sovereign or competent authority? The traditional definition of the criterion of sovereign authority is present in Augustine and can be formulated thus. The decision to go to war can be made and announced only by those who are recognized with the authority, that is, without a political superior. Augustine derived this from natural law, or as he called it, natural order. He writes in the book Against Faustus, quote, "A great deal depends on the causes for which men undertake wars, and on the authority they have for doing so. For the natural order, which seeks the peace of mankind, ordains that the monarch should have the power of undertaking war if he thinks it advisable, and that the soldiers should perform their military duties in behalf of the peace and safety of the community." A ton of things in that small quote, but right now we're pointing out that he indicates the authority to undertake war resides in the office of the monarch. So there would be a great moral difference between an act initiated by one with the authority and the same act being initiated by one without the authority. Quote, "According to the eternal law, which requires the preservation of natural order and forbids the transgression of it, some actions have an indifferent character, so that men are blamed for presumption if they do them without being called upon, while they are praised for doing them when required. The act, the agent, and the authority for the action are all of great importance in the order of nature." In order to demonstrate the ruler's authority to sanction soldiering, Augustine offers a chain of passages from the Gospels which he interconnects. And this is a different quote, but it has a lot of the same references we've seen before. John the Baptist, when the soldiers who came to be baptized said, "What shall we do?" He said, he did not say throw away your arms, give up service. He said, of course, be content with what you pay and do not steal from anybody, etc. And furthermore, the ones about Cornelius, the one about other soldiers in the scriptures, and then of course we get into Romans 13. I'm getting ahead of myself now. The soldiers did not thus avenge themselves of war, but acted according to what their authority had been given to them. Certainly God is the Most High Sovereign. And according to Augustine, when he orders men to undertake war, that war is just by definition. Manichaeans' inferior concepts of justice rendered them unable to grasp the righteousness of the wars in the Bible led by men like Moses. Augustine understands that because God had commanded these wars, it was not only right to fight them, but necessary. Quote, "The account of the wars of Moses will not excite surprise or abhorrence, for in wars carried on by divine command, he showed not ferocity, but obedience. And God, in giving the command, acted not in cruelty, but in righteous retribution, giving to all what they deserved, and warning those who needed warning. But there's a harder question that I want to present to you. If we push on Augustine regarding the right of the authority as ordained by God, we find the ambiguity that I mentioned before. In what form does the command of God, that is to say the direct command of God to fight a war that Augustine talks about, in what form does it come? Is it always in the form, is it limited to the form that Moses and Joshua received it in? Direct revelation, prophetic direction? Or can the demands of natural order available to sanctified reason sufficiently reveal God's will and become divine imperative on the same level as that of Moses' wars? I know what I think, and maybe I know what you think too, but what Augustine thought, well, inferences can be made in either direction. The closest we can get is to say that for Augustine, if the one in authority is, quote, a good man, such as the Emperor Theodosius was in the Battle of the Frigidus, then his decisions are certainly in accordance with God's will. As Philip Wynne said, it would help had Augustine been clear. The ambiguity is demonstrated in a certain passage where Augustine says divine authority permits the taking of life in two exceptions. Being, quote, being justified either by a general law or by a commission granted for a time to some individual. And accordingly, they who have waged war in obedience to a divine command or in conformity with his laws have represented in their persons the public justice or the wisdom of the government, and in this capacity have put to death wicked men, and have not violated the commandment, thou shalt not kill. So Augustine, he gives us two exceptions, either a general law, which allows you to put someone to death, or a divine command. And then he kind of, equates the two in a way that is somewhat, raises more questions. Because he does not explain the distinction that he himself has just made. What is the distinction between the general command, the general law, which permits us to kill, and the direct command of God? Changing gears now, what is explicit in Augustine's take on legitimate authority is that obedience to an unjust command does not make one guilty of injustice, since the responsibility belongs to the one in authority. Not that this had any uniquely Christian character. It rather seems to be a customary legal assumption at the time. Augustine says, a righteous man, serving it may be under an ungodly king, may do the duty to his position in the state in fighting by the order of his sovereign. For in some cases, it is plainly the will of God that he should fight, and in others, where this is not so plain, it may be an unrighteous command on the part of the king, while the soldier is innocent, because his position makes obedience a duty. Now, it should be noted that that whole sentence is buried in a larger sentence, and it serves not as the subject of the argument at all, but rather is an example of generally accepted ethics. So it's hard to really press that Augustine necessarily meant something more applicable than that. At any rate, in Augustine, there is no room for what we might call the rights of conscientious objection. He doesn't recognize it. Moreover, since you incur no guilt by obeying God's deputy, there's no need for those rights. Last resort is a criterion that is said to be met when the situation obviously indicates that nothing short of war will suffice to restore justice to an injury. Augustine affirms this in general ways, saying it is better to achieve peace by diplomacy than by war. See, he wrote to a soldier this: those warriors are indeed great and worthy of singular honor, not only for their consummate bravery, but also, which is a higher praise, for their eminent fidelity, by whose labors and dangers, along with the blessing of divine protection and aid, enemies previously unsubdued are conquered, and peace obtained for the state, and the provinces reduced to subjection. But it is a higher glory still to stay war itself with a word, than to slay men with the sword, and to procure or maintain peace by peace. and not by war. For those who fight, if they are good men, doubtless seek for peace. Nevertheless, it is through blood. Your mission, however, is to prevent the shedding of blood. Yours, therefore, is the privilege of averting that calamity which others are under the necessity of producing. Another criterion of jus ad bellum is that peace is the ultimate objective. Augustine says very eloquently, peace should be the object of your desire. War should be waged only as a necessity, and waged only that God may by it deliver men from the necessity and preserve them in peace. For peace is not sought in order to the kindling of war, but war is waged in order that peace may be obtained. Therefore, even in waging war, cherish the spirit of a peacemaker, that by conquering those whom you attack, you may lead them back to the advantages of peace. Now, theologically speaking, Augustine says there are two kinds of peace, one heavenly and one earthly, as reflects his doctrine of the two cities. And yet within that earthly peace, there are as many different types of peace as there are individuals. For everyone seeks that which will bring himself or his circle his own peace, even if that peace is downright wrong and demonic. Men who pursue their own peace are acting in pride and in the desire to be like God, unable to allow that other men who are created their equals would be in any position save for in subjection to them. Now, all earthly authority shares in this type of peace, even Rome, for there is no perfectly just state. But because this peace is never perfectly just, it is fragile in the hands of whoever holds it and will certainly shatter soon. Point being, there is no man who hates peace in Augustine's thinking. They love an unjust peace, rather. This proportionality is a criterion of jus in bello. This has to do with the criterion that there be minimum force consistent with military necessity would be used, and even then only with an eye toward bringing the conflict to a just conclusion as quickly as possible. In Augustine, this criterion is not very easily unentangled from our previous discussions on right intention, and even Maddux concedes that proportionality can be derived from Augustine, not explicitly, but by way of suggestion. And here is a passage in support. Augustine says, "He whose aim is to kill is not careful how he wounds, but he whose aim is to cure is cautious with his lancet. For the one seeks to destroy what is sound, the other that which is decaying. What is important to attend to is this: who were on the side of truth and who were on the side of iniquity, who acted from a desire to injure and who from a desire to correct what was amiss." As you can see, not directly clear or in great support of this concept of proportionality, but it does sort of flesh out at least the groundwork of what proportionality would become. Discrimination in war is defined as distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants, with the former normally constituting the only acceptable objects of violent action. Augustine said little about this, yet Maddux offers us this quote of Augustine: "As violence is used towards him who rebels and resists, so mercy is due to the vanquished or to the captive, especially in the case in which there is no future troubling of the peace to be feared." Augustine worked to reveal the harmony between the public necessity to seek peace by force or revenge and the private disposition Christ requires in the heart, which makes no resistance to the evildoer. Augustine flatly says that the desire for revenge is not sin, and that Christ does not condemn the desire for revenge. Rather, an eye for an eye and turn the other cheek have this in common: a limit set against vengefulness in hatred. Quote, "The old precept, as well as the new, is intended to check the vehemence of hatred and to curb the impetuosity of angry passion. For who will of his own accord be satisfied with a revenge equal to the injury? There is no injustice in asking back a debt, though there is kindness in forgiving it. Though there is no sin in wishing for revenge within the limits of justice, the man who wishes for no revenge at all is further from sin of an unjust revenge. I don't know, it kind of reminds me of evangelical councils. In expounding on Christ's command to turn the other cheek, Augustine says, quote, "A righteous and pious man ought to be prepared to endure with patience injury from those whom he desires to make good, so that the number of good men may be increased, instead of himself being added by retaliation of injury to the number of wicked men." So the distinction Augustine makes is between the heart and the magisterial authority. Quote, "These precepts concerning patience ought to be always retained in the habitual discipline of the heart, and the benevolence which prevents the recompensing of evil for evil must be always fully cherished in the disposition. At the same time, many things must be done in correcting with a certain benevolent severity, even against their own wishes, men whose welfare, rather than their wishes, it is our duty to consult, and the Christian scriptures have most unambiguously commended this virtue in a magistrate." And Augustine uses the image over and over again of a father who disciplines his child out of love in order to rescue him. This should be the inner disposition of all who punish, including the magistrate. Quote, "He should punish with the same good will which a father has toward his little son, whom by reason of his youth he cannot yet hate. For from this source the most suitable example is drawn, in order that it may be sufficiently manifest that sin can be punished in love, rather than be left unpunished, so that one may wish him on whom he inflicts it, not to be miserable by means of the punishment, but to be happy by means of correction. Therefore, the inward intention, along with the authority to carry it out, can make the use of force just or unjust. Against those heathen who accused the meekness and non-retaliation of Christ of having spoiled the defense of the empire, Augustine replies to the contrary, that it would have been their greatest advantage. Quote, "Let those who say that the doctrine of Christ is incompatible with the state's well-being give us an army composed of soldiers, such as the doctrine of Christ requires them to be. Let them give us such subjects, such husbands and wives, such parents and children, such masters and servants, such kings, such judges, in fine, even such taxpayers and tax gatherers as the Christian religion has taught that men should be, and then let them dare to say that it is adverse to the state's well-being. Yea, rather, let them no longer hesitate to confess that this doctrine, if it were obeyed, would be the salvation of the Commonwealth. And if the Commonwealth, elsewhere he says, if the Commonwealth observe the precepts of the Christian religion, even its wars themselves will not be carried on without the benevolent design that after the resisting nations have been conquered, provision may be more easily made for enjoying in peace the mutual bond of piety and justice. The disposition of the heart can be right even when lawful revenge is executed." Philip Wynne beautifully illustrates this theme of Augustine with an image of typology that brings in the entire narrative of the Scriptures. He says, here the praeparatio cordis, that's the disposition of the heart, is to be understood as an aspect of typology. Praeparatio refers, as it were, to the potentiality of a seed, at first hidden in the recesses of the earth, which at the appropriate time will come into full bloom. So it was the ordo temporum which required that this potentiality be originally hidden in the hearts of the Old Testament patriarchs and prophets and not manifested in exterior actions, so that they then were not only pacifists but waged wars successfully against their enemies. And finally, in conclusion, having done this study, I can attest that learning what the just war theory is and reading the writings of Augustine are two very different intellectual experiences. On a certain level, I think Philip Wynne is correct that the only way Augustine actually proposes what we have received as the just war doctrine is as through a kind of optical illusion, by which we see in Augustine what we now perhaps permanently associate with just war criteria. But in reading those same passages of Augustine in his context, they appear in a bit of a different light. The question whether it is possible to distinguish his comments on war from the doctrine of just war is only slowly beginning to manifest. But Philip Wynne, for his part, is hung up on proving that Augustine was not considered the originator of the just war theory until the last century or so. He points out that though Gratian and Thomas Aquinas in the 12th and 13th centuries rely almost exclusively on Augustine for their exposition of just war, they nowhere credit Augustine as being the original authority. But I say that is to be expected. What medieval Catholic would attribute the origin of any church teaching to one father? Alfred Vanderpoel in the late 19th and early 20th century was most responsible, it seems, for disseminating the opinion for Roman Catholics that the fundamental principles of just war are defined in Augustine's writings. It's the only doctrine of war the Catholic Church has. Nothing the canonists or scholastics ever wrote ever contradicted Augustine, etc. Some writers, as Robert Regieux in the 1930s, later proved that there was no such unbroken chain of agreement. Nevertheless, he too attributed the origination of the just war tradition to Augustine, and from then on it became axiomatic that Augustine was the father of the just war idea. But one of the problems is this, that today we speak under the criteria of headings jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Today these are thought chiefly to be restraints which prevent injuries in conflict. Circumstances are to be measured to see whether or not they reach a point which forces us to undertake war. That's not exactly the standpoint Augustine uses when he talks about war. If I may paint a brush that's too broad, I'd say that Augustine describes war. He's not in the business of giving advice to the general or to the magistrate who must make decisions about war. He's more likely to credit God with the many things God does through war than to say how we should decide how to go to war. Moreover, several historians agree that the topic of jus in bello was not really discussed at all in Augustine or anywhere until the late Middle Ages, most of the interest being in jus ad bellum. And this might be significant since the degree of destruction of which war is capable today is different than it was in Augustine's, and that's mainly a consideration of jus in bello. Let me jump to the chase, and this is the question that Pastor Berg brought up as coming from the Catholic councils. Can the developments in military technology advance to such a degree as to make jus in bello impossible? As I understand, this spring, members of the Vatican Council, co-hosted by the Pontifical Council for Peace and Justice, released an appeal that Pope Francis should issue a document reorienting the Catholic Church's teaching on war. They claim there is no such thing as just war, that destruction is outdated, that to use military force in redressing injustice is to preclude several more desirable peaceful solutions. The, quote, just war doctrine is suspect to these activists since they believe it has been misappropriated too many times. Maybe it has. Modern weaponry is too destructive, they say. Maybe it is. Nonviolent activism has since proven itself effective in achieving peace. Maybe it has. I would say that this movement is merely a historical development in the just war tradition, except they couch it in terms that are altogether hostile to just war. And I think that's a problem. It would appear that the Western Church, with Pope Francis as its figurehead, is moving in a direction away from Augustine's doctrine of just war toward a preference for non-violence. And that's the end.
We have time for maybe one or two questions before lunch.
I have one.
Yes, sir.
I was just thinking, I'm Bert Millard from Westgate, Iowa, by the way. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Did you read anything in Augustine concerning the idea about prospect of success, a reasonable prospect of success in war as being one of the criteria, or one of the criteria discussed by Augustinian scholars concerning war. That's one of the things that I remember from school. I don't know, but you know.
Certainly, John Mark Maddox is able to find something in Augustine to fit everything.
Okay.
But the question is Augustine is he just shoehorning it in? And I think that was one, for the sake of time, that I somewhat passed over. Okay. I've got my resource with me, and I know we're going to talk about it in a panel, perhaps. We can look exactly at, maybe there's a quote that Augustine is cited as having said that can bring that into bear. Yes?
Paul Nuss from Millersburg. I've been listening to Augustine's City of God in an audible version. I know for the benefit of everybody here that if you go out to a app that you can download called LibriVox, it's available for free in a pretty good narration out there, so that you can listen to this very seminal book, which I'm happy to hear that you've studied. I've not read it or studied it in depth. My question to you, so if I'm understanding you correctly, 2 points I'm taking away from your paper are: one, Augustine was really more descriptive than prescriptive when it came to just war. Second, I understand you to say that much of what we have attributed to Augustine with regard to just war, in fact, was developed after the fact in the medieval era, building on Augustine. Are those fair takeaways?
The first point you raised, I want to clarify. Pastor Berg described descriptive and prescriptive war, and that's not what I meant when I said that Augustine speaks descriptively rather than prescriptively. But you're right. In I see Augustine describing what the good man does, what the good magistrate does. And maybe you could say that is prescriptive, because he's evaluating what is right and what is wrong. But he's not interested in sort of the tough casuistry stuff, really, that wants to tickle your fancy, tickle your mind. He's simply saying this is what happens when God desires to punish wickedness, and it is justly undertaken this way. It would be unjust if it happened in such and such a way. And in that case, it feels more descriptive than prescriptive.
You actually, I think, buttressed my takeaway just now by what I understand you to be saying. It's descriptive, not so much of men, but rather of God in Luther's sense of Larva Dei, of the masks of God. That this is what God is doing in and through magistrates and in and through states and kings. When he conducts war, he uses war on this earth. And Augustine is describing that fact. So that's what I'm taking away. Now, my questions to you, first, you didn't touch on this on your paper, but you are a Lutheran pastor. You went to a Lutheran seminary. How do you see, briefly, you can talk about this further in your panel, how do you see Luther appropriating that Augustinian tradition, maybe in a sentence or two? Secondly, how would you, or would you commend the reading of Augustine's City of God to pastors today in a circuit winkle for a discussion purposes, to grasp these purposes? Or, as a takeaway from what you've said, should we really not look for much from Augustine, but instead study that later medieval tradition if we want to get into these issues?
I think looking at Augustine is, I don't know, to me maybe more the more interesting thing to do, because he was such a mind, and he had so many things all conglomerated together, such that you can hardly mess with one thing without messing with another. That is something that the Christian mind ought to exercise itself with, I think, studying Augustine and the City of God, maybe particularly. How about the way Luther appropriated Augustine? I guess I'm kind of curious to see what the later presentations will say about that. When you hear Augustine mentioned multiple times, the paying taxes to Caesar, Romans 13, the soldiers who were not told to throw down their arms. Those are all the same things that we specifically have in our confessions as well, as talking about the goodness of these created orders and of authority. So I know that Luther, of course, would have shared many of the same opinions of Augustine, and I'm curious to see where he departed, if any place. Didn't do a whole lot of great study into Luther on war for this topic, and admittedly, before this presentation, I hadn't studied a whole lot about the theology of war either, but this was kind of my introduction to it somewhat through Augustine and through our Lutheran confessions. But Lutherans can take what Augustine says as befitting his context. He had overlords. Like Pastor Berg said, there are no overlords today. Well, there were in Augustine's day. And one of the agreements, or one of the conversations I'd like to have maybe is Rome was given judicial authority over other sovereign nations. And so it was right for us to be subject not simply to our local government, but to the emperor, who, I could be living in Scotland or in Syria, and I would still be subject to the emperor, who may never have come anywhere near me, who they hardly speak my language, etc. But God had put that authority in charge of my people as well, at least in some way. And that question kind of bugs me. But Augustine is an interesting source because he had this overlord context in history. And he viewed the expansion of the empire also as one of defense sometimes, which is somewhat astounding to perhaps us in our